Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Now, this may surprise you to know, but ships sink. It's an unfortunate fact of life for naval engineers around the world. But it's also great news for divers. Sunken vessels have given intrepid underwater explorers some very interesting things to look at. Today, I've partnered with Getty Images again to look through their archive and find you some very interesting footage. Here are 5 amazing wrecks and their stories. SS Umbria. Not to be confused with the Cunard liner of the same name, the ship is often considered one of the best and most beautiful shipwreck dives in the world. The SS Umbria is located just off Port Sudan in the Red Sea, resting on her port side on about a 60-degree angle in relatively shallow waters. She makes for not only an easy expedition for experienced and beginner divers alike, but also an extremely interesting one. You see, the Umbria is a veritable treasure trove of relics and artifacts, all of which can be safely explored within the span of just a single dive. But aside from the allure of a shallow and decently intact shipwreck, what is it about the Umbria that's so appealing to ship enthusiasts, wartime historians, and ocean explorers alike? Well, it's an interesting story. It all began in Hamburg, Germany in 1912, when the ship started out life as a cargo and passenger steamer dubbed the Bahia Blanca. A few short years later though, she changed hands, coming under the ownership of the Argentinian government for use as a transport ship. In 1935, however, she was acquired by the Italian government to be used as a wartime cargo and troop transport vessel and given the name Umbria. It was during this time that the fires of the Second World War were beginning to ignite, and our fair Umbria was caught in the crossfire. In June of 1940, while Italy was still neutral at the time, there were whispers that this was going to change, and soon. The Umbria, having anchored in Port Sudan to resupply, was detained by 2 British ships, the HMS Grisby and the HMS Leander. Realizing that Italy was heading for entry into the war, the British ships wanted to search the Italian vessel for contraband and smuggled goods. However, word of Italy's entry into the war travelled to Umbria's captain, who knew immediately that he needed a plan to save his crew and cargo, and fast. The British ships gave him permission to call a muster drill, or an evacuation drill, a ruse that he used to safely get his crew off the ship. He then turned his attention to the cargo, a whopping 6,000 tons of bombs, 600 cases of detonators, 100 tons of various weapons, over 2,000 tons of cement, and 3 Fiat 1100 cars. Knowing it was imperative to keep this all out of the hands of the enemy, the captain boldly opted to sink his own ship. With the help of 2 engineers who remained on board, he opened the sea valves and allowed the ship and all of its precious cargo on board to flood and slowly sink beneath the surface. To this day, divers can marvel at the intact wine bottles, machinery, munitions, and even vehicles left on board the Umbria. Most famously, 360,000 individual aircraft bombs remain in the hold of the ship, and while they do not have detonators equipped, divers are encouraged to tread very carefully, as the highly explosive material still has the potential for massive damage should they ever successfully detonate. A timeless display of the audacity and courage of one sea captain and his vessel caught in the crossfires of a war, whose story is told amidst a haunting wreckage, which will continue to transfix explorers and historians for years to come. Portland. Now, it's hardly uncommon to hear of tales of ships lost in battles with rough weather, and the Portland is a very unfortunate example of this. Resting at just over 450 feet below the surface of the Atlantic, off the coast of Massachusetts, the wreck was considered lost for over 110 years, until 2002, when the NOAA, or National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, used remotely operated underwater exploration vehicles to photograph the wreck, confirming her final resting place. She was still largely intact, and the expedition reportedly found artifacts such as dinnerware and utensils, as well as sea life thriving upon her once proud side paddle wheels. But of course, every shipwreck has a story, and this one is that of the Portland, who would soon become known as the Titanic of New England. Built in 1889 by the New England Company to transport passengers between Boston, Massachusetts, and Portland, Maine, the Portland was widely considered one of New England's largest and most luxurious paddle steamers. Her 9-year career travelling back and forth between Portland and Boston had earned her a reputation as an exceedingly safe vessel, having dependably weathered all manner of choppy or stormy seas. However, in November of 1898, while travelling her typical route and carrying some 200 passengers aboard, A perfect storm began to brew off the New England coast, unbeknownst to her captain and crew. This was a time well before the advent of radio communication and radar, so the crew truly had no warning of the impending doom they were to reckon with. Before long, the ship was swept up in a massive blizzard which generated 100-mile-per-hour winds and 60-foot waves that devastated everything in their path, including, most notably, the Portland herself. The catastrophe led to the storm even being dubbed the Portland Gale, after the tragic loss of the ship and all lives on board. To this day, we're still unsure of exactly how many passengers were traveling on board the Portland that day, as the only copy of the passenger list was also on the ship when she foundered. This oversight led to the policy of all ships leaving a second copy of their passenger manifest on shore in case of emergency. But the truly amazing facet of this tragedy is, of course, how long the shipwreck remained lost. There were some accounts of divers coming across the remains of the vessel as early as 1945, but these claims were mainly unsubstantiated. No one truly had definitive proof of the ship's whereabouts until almost 60 years later in 2002. And then, in 2008, a group of experienced divers set out to explore the Portland firsthand. And dives to the Portland had to be cut short, resulting in very little in the way of salvage. Dive lights were said to have imploded due to the pressure, and the divers needed to return to the surface after just about 10 minutes on the wreck. All told, the location of the wreck of the Portland remained an unsolved mystery for almost a quarter of a century longer than Titanic, earning her place among the National Register of Historic Places in 2005. Not all sunken ships are particularly old and historical. There's one that comes to mind that we've actually touched on before on this channel that happened within the last 20 or so years. Rising out of the shallow waters and dense foliage of a tropical jungle, you'll find a modern cruise ship resting on her side and overgrown with greenery. She is the MV World Discoverer. The ship was built in Germany in 1974 as a dedicated cruise ship designed to be small enough to offer unprecedented access to exotic locations where larger ships just couldn't go. The Discoverer was only 85.7 meters, or 287 feet long, and a gross tonnage of just 3,724 tons. This little ship boasted a 13,000-kilometer cruising range, and she used it to good effect, offering intimate cruises to the Falkland Islands, South America, and the South Pacific. One of its real strengths, though, was cruising in the ice. The ship was rated to sail through ice floes and frequently offered cruises to Antarctica or the Arctic Circle. The World Discoverer even carried a small collection of rubber dinghies, so passengers could paddle out for a closer look at the ice floes and glaciers on display. But it wasn't in the ice that the ship ran into trouble, though. On April 30th, 2000, the World Discoverer was sailing around the Solomon Islands when it dragged its hull over a massive uncharted rock or reef. The object penetrated the ship's double hull, so water began pouring in immediately, and the ship's captain had to act fast, collecting all the ship's passengers as she slowly sank. With all its passengers safe and off the ship, the World Discoverer had developed a bad list over to the side, so her captain tried his best to save his ship from sinking by beaching it in the soft sand of an island. Unfortunately, though, the beaching was a little too thorough, and the ship was written off as a total loss. It eventually leant over to 46 degrees on its starboard side, and it still sits like this today. Incredibly, the World Discoverer has never been broken up for scrap or salvage, and it just sits on its side, abandoned in a tropical paradise. Plants have now taken root in the ship's superstructure, and palm trees grow out of its decks. The Salem Express. This wreck is a controversial dive site because its loss resulted in the deaths of hundreds of her passengers. She had originally been built in the 1960s for the French company Générale Transatlantique as the MV Fred Scamaroni, a roll-on roll-off ferry of intermediate size. She changed hands a half dozen times leading up to the late 1980s when she had been renamed Salem Express. She was Egyptian-owned and operated, running between Suez and Jeddah. And in 1991, on what would become her final voyage, the ship was loaded with passengers and cars and set off with many of her complement returning from Mecca in a holiday mood. After deviating from her course, however, the Salem Express ran aground on a coral reef and ripped a huge gash in the hull. She sank within just 20 minutes, and the speed of the sinking caused a panic. Only one lifeboat was successfully launched. Most of the victims were trapped inside the hull, and the exact number of those lost remains in dispute to this day. Lloyd's claimed that there were 644 passengers and only 180 survivors, although the number of those lost may have been way higher than this. One source puts the number of dead at 850. Only 10 of 71 crew members survived. Some had gone back to try to help passengers before becoming trapped themselves. The wreck sits at just over 30 meters or 100 feet deep and lies perfectly on her side. Diving the Salem Express is controversial within the dive community because of the large loss of civilian life, and all through the ship, the touching evidence of those lost is clear. In the passenger areas, dozens of bags and pieces of luggage remain unclaimed and stuffed full of gifts intended for family and friends. In the car bays, vehicles still sit on their sides with their paint schemes still showing. The bicycle is intact down there as well. Many access points for the vessel were welded over, but some can still gain access inside, although the number of human remains within the corridors and rooms inside the ship would be overwhelming even for a seasoned diver. Unfortunately though, some divers have opened the suitcases and retrieved artifacts as souvenirs. The submarine Ruby. Sticking out of the silt over 100 feet down off Saint-Tropez in France, you might be surprised to see the bow section of a very well-preserved submarine sticking out of the silt, potentially even forgiven for thinking this is a German U-boat, but it's actually a French vessel with a very interesting story. The French Navy had some good experience with building submarines. They built a fascinating cruiser submarine armed with 8-inch guns in the 20s named Surcouf. But while the French Admiralty was messing around with novel designs like that, they were also creating a fleet of reliable, trusted vessels that included the submarine Ruby. She was a Sapphire-class sub, one of 6 built in the 20s and 30s for the French Navy, capable of attacking with torpedoes and even laying mines without needing to surface. The ship received action and even awards during the Second World War, sinking with both mines and torpedoes no fewer than 22 ships, equating to 21,000 gross registered tons. It was an impressive tally, but it wasn't enough to save Ruby from the existential threat of peacetime when many ships and submarines were taken apart for scrap. But Ruby would prove useful to the French outside of war, first as a training ship in Toulon, and finally as a sonar target. In 1958, Ruby was towed off the French coast and sunk to conduct anti-submarine training. But her shallow depth and ease of access has made her, today, a popular dive site. And what a sight it is. Sitting upright on the sea floor is the intact hull of Ruby. The bow is unmistakable, but so is the conning tower. The lighter steel plating around the tower has since corroded through, revealing tanks and equipment, and at the after end, the propeller shafts still stick out of the hull, and the rudder is even still in place, although the valuable bronze propellers themselves were removed before she was scuttled. It's probably not just the Ruby's condition that makes her a popular dive site, though. I can think of a few worse places to base yourself for a diving trip than sunny Saint-Tropez. HMS Majestic and E-14. Now we come to a veritable graveyard of ships. The Dardanelles campaign in the First World War claimed a large number of British warships when they were caught out by nets, mines, and naval batteries in the narrow waterways and shallow coasts around Cape Helles in Turkey. With the First World War raging, some in the British Admiralty and government thought that the quickest way to bring the conflict to a close was to invade the Central Powers from the south by initiating an amphibious invasion of Turkey at Gallipoli. The plan called for a lot of daring-do, but it failed to account for the Turks' defensive capabilities. They had extensively mined and defended huge portions of the peninsula, but the plans went ahead anyway, and what resulted on land at Gallipoli is now known as one of the most infamous military slaughters of modern history. But at sea, things weren't much better. Patrolling German submarines picked hapless warships off, while others sailed straight into mines. And to this end, the seafloor here is littered with interesting wrecks, and one of these is HMS Majestic. Majestic is fascinating for being one of the few pre-dreadnought battleship wrecks in the world. Launched in 1895, the warship was fairly powerful for its day, with 4 12-inch or 305mm guns in twin turrets. In 1897, she was a highlight of the Spithead Royal Navy Review, and served as flagship a few times, but by 1915 was hopelessly outdated. She was assigned to help protect the Dardanelles invasion force and was ominously outfitted with mine-catching gear to clear the way, and for her part she engaged the Turkish defence as well, being among the first 3 ships to circumnavigate the entrance to the Dardanelles and bomb Turkish positions, and she even received a hit from the enemy. On May 27th, though, her luck ran out. The German submarine U-21 spotted her and fired a single torpedo, which hit and caused a huge explosion. The old battleship rolled over and in just 9 minutes had completely capsized, taking almost 50 men with her. Her masts and superstructure hit the seabed and stuck, so she didn't sink entirely for many months yet, with her underside pointing perversely up into the air, but then she finally settled and sank beneath the waves. Today, much of the warship's structure remains intact, and you can even see, in this dive footage, what looks to be the blank void and casing that might have led down to ventilate the engine room. Elsewhere, still rising up out of the tangle of twisted steel, looks to be part of one of the ship's smokestacks. Elsewhere, you can find the hulk of the submarine HMS E-14, an intrepid vessel which had actually successfully evaded detection, sneaking into the Sea of Marmara in 1915. She sank a gunboat and then damaged a heavily laden troop ship, the Gul Jamal, which in a previous life was the White Star transatlantic liner Germanic. The British thought that she had sunk, but in reality she survived and was eventually repaired and put back into service. Eventually though, HMS E-14's good fortune ran out in 1918 when she was attacking a Turkish merchant ship. One of her own torpedoes detonated just after leaving the tube, forcing E-14 to surface because she was damaged. She was quickly spotted and engaged by shore gun batteries, where she was badly damaged again and began to sink. Her crew abandoned ship, but only 9 survived, and the wreck was thought lost. It was only in 2012 that E-14 was rediscovered 250 meters or 820 feet from the shore. Only a small part of the bow is visible, rising out of the sand, but crucially, it actually shows a direct hit, possibly showing where the submarine began the flooding that would spell her doom. The wreck is regarded as a war grave, but there are actually 13 other shipwrecks around the Karnakalis Strait that divers can today visit and explore. The Turkish government has mapped out the exact location of the wrecks to encourage dive tourism in the area, making something of an inventory so that thrill-seeking divers across the world can come and explore at their leisure. The underwater documentation can also show the rate of decay of the vessel's hulls and give some idea to archaeologists just how long they can expect to stay around. Each ship offers a fascinating glimpse into the recent past, when men and their steam-powered machines fought for control of the waves. The story of the USS Johnston is absolutely wild and completely deserving of its own movie. The wreck was just recently explored and found to be in a state of wonderful preservation, with its guns still trained towards the enemy it was fighting when it was sunk back in the Second World War. When the Japanese attacked the United States on the 7th of December 1941 at Pearl Harbor, it prompted the largest naval buildup in history. Thousands of warships were built all across America to replace the losses at Pearl Harbor and to overcome the navy of Imperial Japan. In this frenzy of shipbuilding, the USS Johnston was born. She was launched in March 1943 and officially commissioned into the US Navy by October. At the ceremony, Commander Ernest E. Evans told his crew that this is going to be a fighting ship, and I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now. And this was a speech that the Johnston would certainly live up to. Despite only being in operations a little under a year, she would have a distinguished career across the Pacific, taking part in multiple battles and more than earning her place in naval history. Over the next year, the Johnston took part in fighting around the Marshall Islands, the Solomon Islands, and Guam, bombarding various beaches to prepare for American troop landings. In this time, she did not encounter many enemy vessels, as by this point in the war the Japanese Navy had been severely reduced in size. However, off the coast of Bougainville around Buka Island, Johnston did encounter and sink the Japanese submarine I-176 on the 16th of May. This was the very same submarine that had damaged a heavy cruiser, the USS Chester, and then sunk an American submarine, so this was quite a kill for the Johnston. The Johnston was sunk on the 25th of October 1944, fighting the world's largest battleship during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This engagement was legendary, when a small group of American ships, commonly known as Taffy 3, came under attack from one of Japan's strongest remaining fleets, including the mighty Japanese super battleship Yamato, 3 other battleships, and no fewer than 8 cruisers. The Johnston led an almost suicidal counterattack in order to buy time for American aircraft carriers to escape, and for the Japanese to be fended away from a vulnerable force of US troopships and landing craft nearby. This extraordinary bravery helped turn what should have been the Japanese brushing the Americans aside into a highly improbable American victory. One of the officers of the Johnston described the moment he saw the Japanese fleet as feeling like David without a slingshot. Nevertheless, just after dawn, Commander Evans gave the order to attack the enemy fleet with his small group of destroyers. For hours, the Johnston darted between the Japanese ships, firing all of its torpedoes and taking heavy damage. By 9:30 a.m., the ship was dead in the water and finally sank, taking with it 186 of its sailors and Commander Evans himself. The Japanese captain of the destroyer that finally sank the Johnston allegedly saluted the ship as it went down. Despite having a massively superior force, the Japanese fleet actually retreated after this engagement. The absurd confidence and bravery with which the little destroyers had fought were enough to rattle the Japanese into thinking they were walking into a trap. After being sunk, the Johnston disappeared into the Philippine Trench, sinking to one of the deepest parts of the ocean and being lost for more than 75 years until it was rediscovered in 2019. At a depth of 6 kilometers or 3.7 miles, this makes it one of the world's deepest shipwrecks. In fact, it may be that very depth of the wreck that has helped to preserve it. While the crushing pressure and extreme conditions have removed any trace of the crew that sank with their ship, it also means that there is little life to interfere with the wreckage, and it now sits in a very stable environment. A number, 557, is still visible painted on the side of the ship, and its guns are still aimed to starboard, ready to fire upon the Japanese fleet. Interestingly, due to how well preserved the wreck is, shell holes can still be seen in the hull. Judging by the size of these holes, it appears likely that the battleship Yamato was one of the ships to land hits on the Johnston in the opening stages of the battle. An incredible fact, as it continued to fight on for hours afterwards, and a single one of Yamato's gun turrets weighed more than the Johnston herself. In fact, the Yamato alone had a larger displacement than the entire American force it was fighting that day. This small destroyer that took on the pride of Japan now sits in the ocean's deepest grave, perfectly preserved, and guns still trained toward the enemy. Number 2 on this list, the legendary expedition ship, Endurance. The Endurance is probably the most famous ship in the entire history of Antarctic exploration, and a ship that I was personally obsessed with when I was a kid. So you can only imagine my excitement when it was discovered just last year. Ernest Shackleton's legendary 1915 expedition aboard this ship is known across the world, but for over a century, exactly what became of it was a mystery. Since its rediscovery in 2022, we can now see and study this remarkably well-preserved relic from the early days of Antarctic exploration. The Endurance was built in 1912 in Norway, originally as the Polaris, and was intended to take tourists and scientists in luxury to Arctic regions. She had 10 passenger cabins, a dining room, a smoking room, and even a dark room for the development of photographs. No sails would be her primary means of propulsion. She was also fully steam capable and remarkably well designed. She was also made of wood. Steel and iron were by this point in time the usual materials a ship would be built of, but for certain tasks, wood was still the preferred material. Polar exploration was one of these tasks, as reinforced wooden hulls provided a platform that was both strong enough to break the ice and flexible enough to not be destroyed by the freezing conditions and most encounters with shifting ice flows. Unfortunately, the Endurance would, in fact, be destroyed by the ice flows, but at least the thought process was still there. Financial difficulties with the original owners meant that the ship would never operate in its intended role. Instead, it was sold early on to the British explorer Ernest Shackleton in 1914, who renamed the vessel to the Endurance, a reference to his family motto, Fortitudine Vincimus, or by endurance, we conquer. He set off in 1915 with a crew of 27, and they intended to use the ship to take them to the shore of Antarctica, and from there, they would cross the continent on foot. But unfortunately, the ship would become trapped in the sea ice in January 1915. Though the crew was able to start to break through the ice with the help of the ship's engines, the work was slow and arduous, and by February, the ship was stuck fast, and Shackleton could see that there was no purpose in wasting supplies and fuel in trying to break her free. The ship remained stuck in the ice and was used as an operating station for the crew to work from. However, the distance from the shore and the instability of the ice meant that the crew was unable to move too far from the vessel anyway. The Endurance was a well-built ship, designed to stand up to the intense pressures of the Antarctic ice, but eventually, even she had a breaking point. In November, the cracking ice and pressure against the ship became too much. The pressure against the hull caused failures throughout, and essentially crushed the ship into pieces. When the ice finally broke again, the ship sank beneath the waves on the 21st of November, 1915. This event was captured in astonishing photographs by the expedition's photographer Frank Early. The crew of the Endurance would eventually be rescued in 1916 after an absolutely epic overland journey to seek out help, but the ship was thought to be lost until its rediscovery in March 2022. Interestingly, that was exactly 100 years since Shackleton's funeral, in March 1922. The Endurance is resting in the Weddell Sea at a depth of 3 kilometers or 1.8 miles. The wreck must not be disturbed under the International Antarctic Treaty, and no artifacts have been brought to the surface. As for the ship itself, it is astoundingly well preserved, especially for a ship made of wood. Its structure has remained virtually unchanged since it was crushed by the ice, with even the hull and the ship's wheels still intact. Its rigging, though torn apart during the crushing more than a century ago, still rests on the deck, and it's managed to remain so well preserved due to the absence of wood-eating life in Antarctic waters. That doesn't mean that the ship is empty, however. The Endurance has become home to a variety of life forms, including sea sponges and anemones. Protected by treaty and distance, the Endurance will hopefully remain intact on the ocean floor for many decades to come. Number 3, the Swedish warship Vasa. When she was first built in 1628, the Vasa was meant to be the most advanced warship that the Swedish Navy had ever built and launched by that point. It was a huge, elaborately decorated vessel, and the hull was carved with intricate details depicting the Swedish royal family and King Gustav II. The deck housed 64 bronze cannons that would make the Vasa a fearsome weapon of war and serve as a symbol of Swedish military might all across the Baltic Sea. Many issues plagued the Vasa. The design had been meddled with and changed rapidly to meet shifting conditions, and it was sent to sea in spite of known instability problems. Though it was carrying 64 guns, it had been designed with only 32 in mind, and was therefore massively heavier than it was supposed to be. These problems were compounded by the fact that the king himself had ordered the construction and intended to make the Vasa the flagship of his fleet. Those in his government that were aware of the issues surrounding the vessel were unwilling to discuss the design flaws for fear of disappointing the king. In a stability test before the launch, 30 men allegedly ran side to side on the deck of the ship to see how long until it started to roll. They made only 3 trips before the possibility of capsizing became too great, and they were forced to stop the test. Despite this, the ship's launch continued and it was put to sea on the 10th of August. It was almost immediately struck by a gust of wind that pushed the ship onto her port side. The gun ports below flew open and water filled the lower decks. In only a few minutes, the brand new warship sank below the surface. It was only 30 meters or 100 feet deep, so the tips of its masts stuck out of the water, but despite this, over 30 men drowned in the disaster in full view of the people of Stockholm and the king. The wreck of the Vasa was never lost in the same way that the other ships on this list have been. The location wasn't always specifically known, but people always knew the rough area in which the ship was located, and in the centuries between its sinking and its being salvaged and put in a museum, it was visited many times. Several attempts were made to raise the ship, but before 1961 the technology was too primitive to accomplish this. However, in 1961 the remains of the Vasa were raised from the ocean and are now housed in the specially built Vasa Museum. What was extraordinary was just how well preserved the Vasa was, despite having been resting on the ocean floor for over 300 years. An estimated 95% of Vasa's wooden hull was intact due to the cold, salty water it had been resting in. This killed microbes that might have otherwise eaten the wood. On board were around 20 skeletons. Most of these were sailors, but women and children were also found on board, which indicates that the sailors had brought their families to sea with them. Also on board were the remains of food and animals, but probably the most incredible item recovered from the wreck was a perfectly preserved human brain. One poor sailor had his head crushed in by a cannon as the ship rolled and sank, and remarkably, the metal cannon protected his skull and the brain inside. When the body was recovered 333 years later, not only was his skeleton still dressed in his well-preserved clothes, but his brain was able to be retrieved from inside his skull. It had shrunk way down and turned to adipocere, a sort of waxy substance which can happen to well-preserved bodies in watery environments. This well-preserved wreck provides an archaeological tool of incalculable value, as well as offering a fascinating attraction to tourists in Stockholm. In fact, the Vasa Museum is now the most visited museum in Scandinavia. Number 4 on this list is the captivating wreck of the SS President Coolidge, which started life as a luxury liner and is today instead guarded by a moray eel. President Coolidge was an ocean liner built in the early 1930s to capitalize on the passenger trade across the Pacific, running from San Francisco out to Manila and Kobe. The ship, along with her sister, President Hoover, was designed with the upper class in mind, those who had money to drop on expensive ocean-going holidays across the Pacific. She was fitted throughout with sumptuous fittings and novelties like telephones and a soda fountain, the latter of which, because this was the height of the Prohibition and the ship, being US flagged, was unable to stock alcohol. In the lead up to the Second World War, the ship was used to evacuate refugees fleeing the advancing Japanese Imperial Army. But then, in 1941, she was called up as a troop ship. At first, things went well for her. Most of her luxurious features were gutted so that she could fit in as many as 5,000 troops, and she sailed in convoys, even visiting Melbourne, my hometown. But then her luck ran out. In October 1942, the ship was attempting to navigate its way through a wide main channel into Espirito Santo harbour when it was rocked by two huge explosions. Mines had been laid in the channel, but this wasn't passed on to the ship's captain, Nelson. He immediately knew he was going to lose his ship, so he drove it onto the land in an attempt to beach her and prevent a total sinking. But unfortunately, she came to rest shy of the shoreline on a coral reef, which prevented the full beaching. Regardless, over 5,000 men evacuated the ship down ladders in a neat, orderly fashion, with some even simply just walking ashore. And as the ship began to settle in the water, Captain Elwood Hewitt, an artillery officer, heard tell that there were men trapped in the infirmary on board. He raced back and rescued the men, but he was lost in the attempt. Only he and one other man who'd been killed in the initial mine blast lost their lives that day. The President Coolidge, once the favourite of millionaires and wealthy Americans, rolled onto her side and sank beneath the waves when she slipped off the reef. After the war, President Coolidge was stripped of many valuable fittings, including her propeller blades, electric motors, shell casings, and copper tubing. Today she lies on a slope so that the bow is only 70 feet or 21 metres deep, while the stern is over twice that. But divers today can see many remnants of the ship's past as a luxury ocean liner poking out from the silt. The most famous piece is known simply as The Lady, a porcelain relief of a woman and a unicorn, still in vibrant colour. But elsewhere on the ship are reminders of her military career, rifle rounds, and even jeeps, which were supposed to be delivered to the American forces in the Pacific. In the medical bay, jars and bottles of medicine still line shelves that the doctors and nurses would once have used to treat ailing soldiers. At the time, the President Coolidge was carrying an enormous stock of quinine, over 200 kilograms or 591 pounds, which was crucial in treating malaria. Down in the engine room, you can still find gauges and levers. Give the glass a wipe and you might still be able to make out the readings from the dials. Elsewhere, toilets line the walls and bathrooms still have their tiles, wash basins, and baths intact. Scattered around the seafloor are piles of gas masks and even coral-encrusted rifles. Divers today are familiar with the wreck's unlikely guardian, a giant moray eel named Nessie, who was taken to living in the winches on the wreck's bow. And passing divers even feed her when she pops her giant head out to say hello. Number 5 on this list is the terrifying sinking of the Daniel J. Morrell. Unfortunately, I can't legally show you many of the incredible photographs taken from inside this ship, but the story of its sinking is almost beyond belief, and I'll provide a link down below in the description for you to see some amazing photographs taken from deep within the wreck in the recent past. Of all the ships on the Great Lakes, it's probably the mighty bulk freighters which attract the most attention and fanfare. The Daniel J. Morrell was a huge ship built in 1906 and nicknamed the Queen of the Lakes because at 603 feet or 184 meters in length, she was the longest ship then afloat in the region. The ship was used primarily to carry bulk cargoes like iron ore, coal and grain. For an incredible 60 years, the ship faithfully did just that. But then in 1966, the ship's impressive career came to a shocking and violent end. It was the last run of the season in November. The ship was sailing empty of cargo when a monstrous storm rolled in. Winds topped 70 miles per hour or 110 kilometers per hour, and waves crashed over the height of the ship. She steamed desperately for shelter at Thunder Bay. By 2 a.m, had taken on so much water that she seemed doomed. Her crew assembled on deck and they were battered by winds and waves, many jumping or being washed overboard and lost in the freezing, surging water. But then at 2:15 a.m, the long ship broke in half, and the remaining crew in the bow section were able to load themselves into a raft. Then there came a call of relief. A ship's lights were spotted off in the distance. The men must have thought they were saved, but then to their horror they realised that this looming shape wasn't a rescue ship at all. It was the second half of their ship. The boilers and engines had remained intact and they were still turning. Now the zombie stern section was chugging along by itself in the water, totally out of control, and bearing straight down on the raft. At the last minute, the raft was washed clear and the stern section disappeared off into the darkness, described by author William Radigan as being like a great wounded beast with its head shot off. In the end, there was only one survivor who had clung to life through the wild and frigid night. He was found in a lifeboat with the bodies of his comrades who didn't make it. The truth was that the old cargo carriers like Daniel J. Morrell were simply too long and used too brittle a grade of steel to stand up to the forces of a storm at sea, and many were lost when they were swamped or broke in half. And probably the most famous of these was the Edmund Fitzgerald. The Daniel J. Morrell's wreck was found in 1980 in those two halves, with the stern section some 5 miles or 8 kilometers away from the bow. As always, the most haunting relics are those that tell the stories about the human cost. A single shoe sits in the silt, long separated from its owner, a chilling reminder of the 28 men who lost their lives the night the Daniel J. Morrell broke its back and sank. Finally, we'll end on what is potentially one of history's most unlucky ships. Today, you can see part of her bow peeking out from above the waters in Captain Bay, Unalaska, and her story is nothing short of bizarre. Northwestern started out as a steam-powered freighter in 1889, built in Pennsylvania for services around Alaska. From the outset, though, the ship earned a reputation for trouble, suffering from groundings and collisions that would last throughout her career. In 1907, the ship first ground on a reef, was refloated and underwent repairs, but she was beached again soon afterward, having developed a leak. She was again refloated and was towed for repairs, but then the tug towing her ran aground in the fog. Later on, she collided with another ship in 1911 and ran aground again in 1910, 1913, 1915, and again years later in 1933. But remarkably, she was refloated every time. I can't tell if this is the luckiest or unluckiest ship in history, but for some reason the US Navy thought it would be good to put this absolute lunatic of a vessel into service during the Second World War, and she was used to house harbour workers in Unalaska, the Aleutian Islands. The Japanese bombed the area in June 1942, but of course Northwestern was hit, badly damaged and consumed by flames. She was abandoned and eventually sank on the spot in around 1946 in Captain Bay. Nowadays, a good portion of the Northwestern's hull remains visible and recognisable above the waterline. The bow sticks out, rusted to a dull orange, but you can clearly make out the rough shape of it and the houses for the anchors. On the forward deck, the ship's anchor windlass sits intact where it was fitted 130 years ago, but moving further aft from there, the ship's side plating has begun to fold inward like wet cardboard. If you look closely, you can see the remains of the ship's forward mast, which once stood proudly over the vessel but now lays draped over its decks, which themselves are covered in a nice dense layer of green turf. Be a nice spot for a picnic. Northwestern is a fascinating ship with a strange story, and her little-known wreck, which itself is in such a good state of preservation, is probably one of the most interesting of its kind in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. And as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.